My name is Nathaniel Clark. I'm a systems analyst living in Des Moines, Iowa, where cornfields roll to the horizon and the air hums with a quiet rural rhythm. It's not the most glamorous city, but I've always appreciated its simplicity, the calm, the lack of noise compared to places like Chicago or New York. Des Moines feels safe, familiar, and yet even in this haven of stillness, there's a void that echoes louder than any city traffic. That void? Family. I was born in a small town outside St. Louis, Missouri, where my parents, Leonard and Tricia Clark, still live. I also have a younger brother, Brandon. He's 2 years my junior, but has always been treated like the crown prince of the family. Where Brandon shines bright, I exist quietly in the corners. I've always been the one who didn't demand attention, who worked hard, stayed out of trouble, did what was asked. But in my family, silence doesn't earn you love. Flash does. Brandon had flash. Growing up, I loved to tinker. While Brandon was winning school awards or charming neighbors, I was in the garage taking apart radios, trying to figure out how they worked. I built my first computer at 12. My parents called it a weird phase. Brandon got a new bike the same year. He's outdoorsy, they said, as if that explained everything. Brandon's charm was magnetic. Teachers adored him. Friends rallied around him. My parents? They built a pedestal and placed him high above it. I remember parent-teacher nights where my mother would listen to my teacher's praise with a polite smile, only to light up with genuine pride when it was Brandon's turn. "He's such a leader," they'd say. "So confident, so promising." And they believed it. I wasn't bitter then. I just hoped, foolishly, that maybe one day they'd see me too. As we got older, that imbalance never changed. Brandon went to business school. My parents paid for every dime, tuition, apartment, even his internship abroad. I went to a state college on scholarships and part-time work. I never asked them for help. I didn't want to be a burden. I thought they'd respect that. They didn't even notice. When I graduated with a degree in computer science, I got a job right away, systems analyst for a mid-sized logistics firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. I built a small life in Des Moines, rented a modest apartment, and spent my evenings reading or coding side projects. I didn't expect applause, but I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd call to say, "We're proud of you." They never did. Instead, the phone calls were always about Brandon. "He's expanding his business," Mom would say. "He's networking with major players." Or, "He might be on TV this week." They were so invested in his life that I started to wonder if they remembered mine existed. I wasn't jealous. I just felt invisible. Holidays were the worst. I'd ask if I could come home. The answer was always vague. "This year's a bit hectic," they'd say. Or, "Brandon's bringing clients home. We need to keep it small." So I spent Thanksgiving and Christmas alone in Des Moines, heating up store-bought turkey and watching movies on an old laptop. My only tether to warmth was my grandfather, Harold. He was my father's father, a retired war veteran with a quiet but powerful presence. He lived alone in a cozy farmhouse an hour from my parents. Grandpa Harold was the only one who saw me, the only one who'd call just to ask how I was, the only one who'd say, "I'm proud of you, Nate." When I was 10, he taught me how to whittle. "You carve away everything that doesn't belong," he said, handing me a small pocket knife and a block of pine. "Eventually, what's left is what matters." That day, I carved a crude little bird. He kept it on his mantle for years. When I visited Grandpa, I felt seen, understood. He never asked why I wasn't like Brandon. He just liked who I was. Over the years, I visited him often, especially around holidays. We'd drink black coffee, talk about old westerns, or sit in comfortable silence as wind rustled through the corn outside. I'd fix his computer or help him with his heating system. He'd give me his old books, his old tools. We didn't say much, but somehow he said everything I needed to hear. Then last fall, Grandpa died. He passed in his sleep, peacefully, they said. My mother called me a day after the funeral was already planned. "It'll just be close family," she said, clearly meaning Brandon and a few others. "You don't have to come all the way out." I did come. I drove 6 hours through the night. I stood in the back of the funeral home, unseen, while my parents sat in the front row with Brandon. No one turned around. No one noticed. After the service, I walked alone to Grandpa's grave. I placed a small wooden bird on the headstone, one I'd carved that week. Just like the first one he kept all those years. I whispered thanks for everything. Then I turned and walked away, deciding then and there that I was done begging to be seen. Weeks passed. Then one day, a week before Christmas, I got a call. It was my father. His name on my phone screen made my stomach drop. I stared at it, wondering if it was a mistake. We hadn't spoken in months. I answered. "Nathan," he said, his voice unexpectedly warm, "we want you home for Christmas this year." I froze. "What?" I asked. "It's been too long," he continued. "Your mother and I miss you. Brandon does too." I didn't know how to respond. I heard the words, but they felt wrong. Too rehearsed, too polished, like lines from a play I hadn't been cast in. "I have work on the 24th, I said cautiously. "Might be late." "No problem. Come when you can." After we hung up, I sat on my couch in silence. Something about the call didn't sit right. My father's voice, too sweet. My mother's absence on the line. The sudden warmth after years of cold. Still, a part of me wanted to believe. Maybe they finally saw me. Maybe this time I was more than just the shadow behind Brandon. So I packed a few things, wrapped some gifts, and planned my drive. 6 hours through winter roads, 6 hours toward a family I wasn't sure I knew anymore. But I would learn soon enough. What waited for me on the other side of that drive was nothing I could have prepared for. December 24th dawned with a thin sheet of ice on my window pane and a sky the color of steel. Snow hadn't started yet, but the forecast was grim, an incoming storm stretching across the Midwest, threatening to coat the highways with danger. Still, I packed my duffel bag with warm clothes and slid 3 wrapped gifts into the back seat. A soft cashmere scarf for Mom, a leather toolkit for Dad, and a bottle of Merlot for Brandon. They were thoughtful gifts, real ones, chosen not out of obligation, but a fragile hope that maybe this year, something would be different. By 1:30 p.m., I was on the road, Des Moines in my rearview mirror, the barren Iowa landscape rolling endlessly ahead of me. My car's heater worked overtime while the radio spilled Christmas carols into the silence. But I didn't sing. My thoughts were too loud. I kept thinking about that phone call. My father had sounded almost gentle, something I couldn't remember hearing since I was a kid. I wanted to believe it was real, that they'd finally realized I was worth more than the spare chair at the edge of the table, that they were ready to fix the fractures between us. But in the back of my mind, something twisted uneasily. Why now? Why, after years of ignoring my messages, brushing off my visits, and forgetting my birthday 3 years in a row? Still, I told myself to give them a chance. People change. Time softens even the hardest edges. Maybe losing Grandpa had stirred something inside them. As I crossed into Missouri, the sky turned heavy. Thick, fat snowflakes began to fall, dusting the fields and the long, lonely highway. My hands tightened on the wheel. I slowed to 45 and kept my eyes forward, headlights slicing through the pale curtain of snow. 6 hours stretched into nearly 8. My wipers squeaked in protest, fighting against ice buildup. My back ached, my fingers stiffened, and my stomach rumbled from skipping lunch. But I didn't stop. I just wanted to get there, get it over with, and see if what waited on the other side of this drive was worth the weight it carried. It was nearly 9 p.m. when I pulled up to my childhood home in Chesterfield. The street was dark, except for a few scattered Christmas lights blinking weakly along fences. But our house? It was lit up like a Christmas postcard. Icicle lights dangling from the roof, glowing reindeer on the lawn, even a plastic Santa by the porch. I parked around the corner. Not out of secrecy, but habit. I'd done it so many times, like I didn't want to intrude too loudly on a world that had long moved on without me. I stepped out into the cold, the wind immediately biting my face. I grabbed the gifts and walked through the snow-dusted lawn, my breath fogging the air. The back kitchen door was usually left unlocked. It always had been. I figured I'd slip in quietly, surprise them. Maybe get a warm greeting. Maybe see the astonishment on their faces when I arrived earlier than expected. I climbed the back porch steps, my boots thudding softly. Light leaked through the frosted glass of the kitchen door, and laughter trickled out. My father's low rumble, my mother's crisp chuckle, Brandon's unmistakable laugh. They were deep in conversation. I smiled a little despite myself. Maybe they were happy. Maybe this year I was truly wanted. I reached for the door handle, but paused. Something in their tone stopped me cold. The laughter had faded. The voices had shifted. Lower now, serious, urgent. I pressed my ear closer, the gift bag trembling in my hand. "Just get him to sign it. That's all we need," my father said, his voice tense. "Don't make it a big deal," my mother chimed in. "Wrap it like a gift if you have to. Nathan will do it. He's always eager to please." My chest tightened. "What if he asks questions?" Brandon asked. "He won't," Mom snapped. "He's never questioned anything we've asked before. He's the quiet one, remember? The easy son. This is why it has to be him." I don't want him to suspect," Brandon muttered. "If the court looks into it, they won't," Dad said firmly. "It'll be in his name, his record's clean. If anyone asks, it's a family gift. It's just paperwork." My throat went dry. I stepped back from the door, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The air outside suddenly felt colder, heavier. They weren't inviting me home for Christmas. They were setting me up, using me. And what hurt the most wasn't the scheme, it was the way they talked about me. Like I was stupid, gullible, a pawn they'd saved for when things got bad. My hands clenched around the gift bag. I stood there, frozen, listening to my own family plot to use my name to protect Brandon's assets likely at risk from bankruptcy or legal trouble. They spoke as if it was already done. As if I didn't matter. As if I was just a signature away from saving their golden child's empire. A gust of wind pushed against the porch, stinging my eyes. But the tears that welled up weren't from the cold. I turned, walked down the stairs, and trudged through the snow, each step heavier than the last. My car was parked a block away, hidden in the shadows. I tossed the gift bag into the back seat and slammed the door shut, my breath fogging the windshield. They hadn't changed. They didn't miss me. They needed me, and the second they had what they wanted, they would vanish again. Just like always. I stared at the glowing house from a distance, the twinkling lights now feeling sinister. Hollow. The warmth I'd imagined was a lie, a trap wrapped in tinsel. My fingers hovered over the ignition. I could have gone in, confronted them, shouted, demanded answers, but I knew what would happen. They'd twist it, make me feel guilty, paint me as paranoid, ungrateful. They always had. Instead, I turned the key. The engine roared to life, but I wasn't driving home. I was driving to the only place I still felt like a person. Grandpa Harold's house. Even though he was gone, I still had the keys. It was an hour west, an old farmhouse on a quiet hill surrounded by frozen fields. A place that had never demanded anything of me. A place where love wasn't conditional. The snow thickened as I drove, but I kept going, gripping the wheel with frozen hands and burning eyes. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't break down. I just drove. And with every mile, I let go of hope, of illusion, of the idea that blood meant anything when love wasn't there to back it up. By the time I pulled up to Grandpa Harold's house, it was past 10:30 p.m. The snow was falling steadily, blanketing the gravel driveway and fields beyond in a soft, ghostly white. His old farmhouse stood quiet and dark at the top of the hill, but to me it felt warmer than the house I'd just left behind. I stepped out into the silence, snow crunching beneath my boots. I didn't have a plan. No grand confrontation, no righteous speech. I just needed to be somewhere that didn't make me feel small. Somewhere that didn't twist my kindness into a weakness. Grandpa's house hadn't changed. The wind chime he made out of copper pipes still hung by the porch, clinking softly in the wind. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me instantly. Old cedar, worn books, and something faintly metallic. His presence still lingered in the air, like the walls remembered. I didn't bother turning on the lights at first. I just stood there in the dark, letting the silence wrap around me. Then I closed the door, kicked off my boots, and dropped onto the couch like I'd done so many times growing up. It was the same plaid couch I'd napped on as a kid after hours of helping Grandpa fix his radio or repaint the tool shed. I remembered how he'd toss me an old wool blanket and tell me, "You've done enough for today. Rest." And now, resting was all I could do. I woke the next morning to soft light filtering through the lace curtains. Christmas Day. The house was cold, the kind of deep winter chill that crept into your bones. I got up, made a fire the way Grandpa had taught me, kindling first, then logs stacked like ribs, and soon the room glowed with flickering warmth. I found an old can of coffee in the pantry and brewed it in his dented kettle. It was bitter and strong, but it brought me back. As I sat by the fire with the coffee warming my hands, I realized I didn't feel as broken as I had the night before. Still angry, yes, still stunned, but not shattered, because somehow, sitting there in Grandpa's worn flannel robe, I knew I'd made the right choice. Later that morning, I found a box in the attic labeled Nathan for when you're ready. The handwriting was unmistakable, Grandpa's. My breath caught. I brought the box down and placed it on the coffee table. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were little things, the kind only someone who truly knew you would keep. A carved wooden compass with my initials, a photo of me and Grandpa fixing a fence post in the rain, a notebook full of his scrawled thoughts, daily musings, advice, memories. But what hit hardest was the letter. It was tucked in a small envelope, yellowed at the corners. My name was written on the front. I unfolded the paper carefully, holding my breath. Nate, if you're reading this, it means something didn't go the way it should have. I can't know when or why you'll need this, but I do know you'll find your way here when the world turns cold. I've watched you grow into a man of quiet strength. You've never needed the spotlight. You've always done what's right, even when it hurt. And I've seen how that's been taken for granted. I tried to speak up over the years, to tell your father and mother what they were missing. But people don't always hear what they don't want to believe. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It means they're blind. You don't owe anyone your life just because they share your name. You owe it to yourself to live with dignity, with pride. If the day comes when they try to take advantage of your kindness, I want you to remember this. Kindness is not weakness. Your silence is not submission, and your worth is not for them to define. You are enough, Nathan. You always were. Love, Grandpa. I didn't cry, not right away. I just stared at the letter, letting every word sink in. Every syllable felt like a rope pulling me back from the edge. He knew, he'd always known, and somehow he had left behind exactly what I needed, at exactly the moment I needed it. I spent the rest of Christmas Day there. I made a simple meal, scrambled eggs and toast. I sat in the sunroom with a blanket over my lap and watched the snow fall across the fields. I reread the notebook Grandpa had filled with little pieces of wisdom. People will treat you how you let them. Some battles you fight by walking away. Being the better man doesn't mean being the quieter one. Sometimes it means saying no and walking out the door with your head high. By evening, the storm had slowed. The sky had turned lavender, and the world outside looked like it had been paused, peaceful in its frozen silence. My phone buzzed for the first time that day, a text from my mother. "Nathaniel, where are you? We waited all day. The food's going cold." I stared at the message for a long time. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "We're worried." Just, "The food's going cold." I didn't reply. Instead, I took the photo of Grandpa and me and placed it on the mantel next to the carved compass. I stoked the fire and settled back into the couch. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I was just being. And that, somehow, was enough. Bölüm Forichin Devamet. Bölüm 412. The next morning, I woke to silence. Deep, white silence. The kind that only exists after a heavy snow blankets everything, swallowing sound and slowing time. Sunlight streamed through the frost-glazed windows of Grandpa's farmhouse, casting golden lines across the worn wooden floor. I lay on the couch a moment longer, listening to the old house breathe. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, but the room still held its warmth like a memory. I didn't feel ready to leave, not because I was afraid, but because I had nothing to return to, not really. Des Moines held my job, my apartment, my routine. But here was where I'd remembered who I was, where I'd found the quiet strength my family had always overlooked. Still, I knew I couldn't hide here forever. Eventually, life would resume, work would call, obligations would rise from the snow like weeds in spring. But before any of that happened, there was one thing I knew I had to do. I had to face them. Not for their sake, but for mine. I spent that day in preparation. I cleaned the house out of respect. I made a fresh fire, brewed another pot of Grandpa's coffee and took it with me to the small office he used to use, tucked in the back of the house, a place filled with dusty books, old war medals, and paper maps pinned to the walls. I sat at his desk, pulled out my laptop, and opened a blank document. Then I wrote. Not for work, not for anyone else, but for myself. It began as a letter, but it quickly turned into something else. A story. A reckoning. I wrote everything. The way my parents had treated me growing up. The silence I endured, the holidays I spent alone, the favoritism, the gaslighting, the way I was only ever called when someone needed something. I wrote about Brandon, how I'd loaned him money without question, even when it meant skipping rent, how I cheered for him while he ignored me, how I watched my parents celebrate every one of his mediocre achievements while mine disappeared into the void. I wrote about that night at the kitchen door, the way they spoke about me like a tool, like a loophole, a scapegoat, a disposable shield for their favorite son's failures. The words poured out of me, faster than I could type. And when I finished, I stared at the screen, breathless, as if I'd run a marathon I didn't know I was in. It wasn't a letter anymore. It was my story. And for the first time in my life, it was told exactly the way I needed it to be. I saved the file, printed it out, and folded the pages into an envelope. Then I drove. The roads were still slushy, the air still sharp, but I didn't hesitate. I didn't park around the corner this time either. I pulled right into the driveway of my parents' house. The same reindeer lights blinked lazily on the porch. The plastic Santa stared at me like it had the night before, but this time I stared back. I walked up the steps and knocked. No surprise this time, no hesitation. I stood tall. It was my father who answered the door. His face flickered with something. Shock, relief, guilt, I couldn't tell. But he stepped aside silently and let me in. The house was warm, overly so. The scent of pine and cinnamon candles hung thick in the air, trying too hard to cover something rotten. My mother appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Nathaniel," she said softly, like I was a stray cat finally returning home. We were worried. I held up the envelope. "I'm not here to talk, just here to drop this off." They looked confused, but I didn't care. I stepped into the living room and spotted Brandon by the fireplace, still in pajamas, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. He glanced up, startled. I placed the envelope on the coffee table. Inside were the pages I'd written. My truth. "I suggest you read it," I said. "All of it. Don't skim, don't defend yourselves, just read." My mother took a step forward. "Nate, listen, if this is about the paperwork." I cut her off. "This isn't about paperwork. It's about 30 years of being invisible, of being used, of watching you pour love into one son while rationing it out to the other like breadcrumbs." They stared at me, silent. "I overheard everything," I added, voice steady. "Your plan, the lies, how little you actually think of me." My father's jaw clenched. Brandon looked down. "You've already said everything I needed to hear," I continued. "This letter isn't for me. It's for you. To show you exactly what you've done. Not that I expect you to care, but I needed to say it." My mother opened her mouth again, probably to ask for forgiveness, but I shook my head. "I'm not here for apologies. I don't need them. I'm not here to fix anything. I'm here to end it." I turned to leave, but just before I reached the door, I looked over my shoulder and said, "From now on, I decide what family means to me. And it doesn't start with blood. It starts with respect, with love, with truth." Then I walked out, into the snow, into the cold, into my life, and for the first time it felt like mine. I didn't look back, not once. I got in my car, closed the door, and sat in the silence, staring at the windshield wipers gently brushing away the snow. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from the release of 30 years of buried weight. I'd done it. I said what needed to be said. Not to cause pain, not for revenge, but to finally tell my story out loud, to let the truth ring in their ears as clearly as it had echoed in my mind for so many years. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel. Power. Not the kind you use to dominate, the kind you use to stand tall. I started the engine and began the drive back toward Des Moines. The sky was gray, but the roads had cleared slightly. A thin trail of slush followed my tires as I drove through small towns and quiet farmland, each mile putting distance between me and everything that had once held me down. But I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel alone. I felt free. When I arrived back at my apartment, the streetlights were just flickering on. Des Moines was quiet in the aftermath of the holidays. Shop windows dim, snow piled along the curbs, wreaths still hanging in places. I parked, carried my bag upstairs, and unlocked the door to my small, clean apartment. The cactus on my windowsill was still there, stubborn, green, and thriving despite the cold. I stood in the middle of the room, the silence hugging me like a familiar friend. This was home. It wasn't grand. It didn't smell like cinnamon or roasted ham. There were no family photos lining the walls. But this space, this was mine, built by my own hands, sustained by my own effort. I unpacked, made a pot of tea, and sat down by the window. The city lights blinked in the distance, casting a soft glow across the snow-draped landscape. I thought about the letter. I imagined them reading it, my parents and Brandon, sitting around that expensive dining table, each word stripping away the illusions they had built for themselves. Maybe they would argue. Maybe they would tear it up. Maybe they'd never speak of it again. That was fine. It wasn't for them. It was for me. That night, I opened a fresh document on my laptop. I stared at the blank page for a long time, then began to write again. But this time, it wasn't about pain. It was about healing. I wrote about Grandpa's house, the fireplace, the coffee, the letter, the things that reminded me who I was. I titled it, What I Learned from the Man Who Saw Me. I published it anonymously on a small blog I'd set up months ago but never used. I didn't expect anyone to see it. It was just a way to let go. But the next morning, I woke up to 3 comments, then 7, then 40. People wrote things like, "This is my life too. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for putting it into words. You don't know how much I needed this. You made me feel seen." Each word from strangers wrapped around me like a soft blanket. Their stories poured in, some from people who'd been overlooked, others from those who'd finally walked away. It hit me then. My story mattered, not just because it was mine, but because it echoed, because someone out there needed to hear what I'd learned the hard way. Over the next few days, I kept writing. Not every post was long or perfect. Some were just fragments of thoughts. Others were small reflections about the strength of saying no, about finding peace in solitude, about learning that love doesn't always come from where we expect. I wasn't trying to be a writer. I was just being honest. And somehow, that honesty found a home. One day, someone sent me a message through the blog. She wrote, "Your words made me call my sister for the first time in 5 years. I thought our bond was broken, but maybe it just needed truth." That message stayed with me, because I realized that truth doesn't just break, it heals. It creates space. It frees the ones who have lived in silence. I wasn't sure what was ahead, but I no longer feared it. The past had lost its hold on me. The ghosts at that dinner table didn't follow me anymore. They stayed behind, buried under the snow of their own making. And I was stepping forward, one word, one breath, one page at a time. January passed in a hush of snow and silence. Des Moines remained frozen, the streets lined with brittle trees and bundled strangers. But inside my apartment, something had thawed. Not the temperature, but me. My blog, the one I had started simply to vent, had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. It now had hundreds of readers. People emailed me to share their stories of being the forgotten sibling, the used child, the quiet one dismissed until they weren't useful anymore. It was like pulling back a curtain and realizing there were thousands of people just like me, walking through life, carrying wounds shaped like family. And somehow, they trusted me with those wounds. I didn't know what to do with that at first. I wasn't a therapist. I wasn't even a writer in the traditional sense. I just wrote what was real, what was mine. But over time, I realized that maybe that was enough. Maybe, just maybe, telling the truth with kindness and clarity was exactly what people needed. So I kept going. I began setting a routine. Wake up, make coffee, read emails, write, work on client software projects, take walks, feed the plants. And every evening I made time to write about grief, about guilt, about strength, about the strange peace that follows when you finally stop begging for love that should have been freely given. One evening in early February, I received a message from a woman named Clara. She wrote, "I'm a teacher in Utah. I've been using your posts as journal prompts for my high school students in our creative writing class. I hope that's okay." One of them, an incredibly shy boy, said your story helped him tell his parents he no longer wanted to study medicine. He wants to be a sculptor. He thought he was going to disappoint them forever. Thank you for helping him believe he's allowed to choose his own life. I read that message 4 times. It humbled me in a way I can't describe. Because if all the pain I had swallowed, if all the silence, all the betrayal, all the long nights alone, could be transformed into something that helped someone else stand up and say, "This is who I am," then maybe, just maybe, none of it had been in vain. But as the blog grew, so did something else. Whispers. Not from strangers, but from home. My uncle, who I hadn't spoken to in years, sent a message through LinkedIn of all places. It was brief. "I read your story. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't realize it was that bad. I'm sorry." A childhood friend from my old neighborhood commented on one of my posts anonymously. "You were always the one who stayed quiet, but you were also the one who helped me with math, who stood up for me when kids teased me for my stutter. I see you now. I wish I'd seen you better then." Even my cousin, Brandon's goddaughter, sent a message. "They're talking about you back home. Your blog, your story. You've made them uncomfortable. But also, I think you've made them reflect." That word, reflect, felt heavy, because I had lived so long in a world where my family never looked inward, where apologies didn't exist, where acknowledgement was a foreign language. So when I got a letter in the mail one morning, handwritten and stamped from my hometown, I stared at it for a long time. It was from my mother. I sat at my kitchen table, fingers trembling slightly as I opened it. Inside, on crisp cream stationery, her looping handwriting covered both pages. The letter was complicated. She said she had read the blog, said she recognized herself in the stories, said it hurt. She didn't deny anything. That surprised me. She didn't try to defend their actions. She didn't blame me for airing it publicly. Instead, she wrote this: "We thought you were the strong one. We assumed you didn't need as much. But that was our excuse. We leaned on your silence and used it to ignore what you needed. And we're sorry. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive us. I just wanted you to know. We hear you now." I didn't cry. I didn't throw the letter away. I simply folded it back up and placed it in the drawer next to Grandpa's note. Because forgiveness, like healing, takes time, and I had finally learned that it's okay to take that time. That evening, I wrote a new post, "When they say they're sorry and you're not ready to answer." In it, I talked about the discomfort of hearing apologies too late, about how healing isn't linear, about how even when people start to change, you're allowed to protect your peace until you're ready to re-engage. The post reached more people than anything I had written before. It was shared thousands of times. And in the comments, people whispered their own truths. "I needed to hear this today. My parents apologized, but I still can't talk to them. And that's okay. I've spent my life forgiving too soon. Thank you for reminding me that waiting is not cruelty. It's survival." In that moment, I felt it again, that strange, quiet power of truth. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't broken. I was whole. And for the first time in my life, I had created something not out of pain, but out of the strength that pain had forged in me. The snow finally melted in March. I remember the exact day because I stood by my window, coffee in hand, watching the ice break apart on the street below like it was giving up a long fight. That morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds in a way that felt symbolic, soft, golden, insistent. The kind of light that says, "You've survived the worst of it. Now breathe." I'd been doing a lot of that lately. Breathing, pausing, letting myself feel the weight of being free after so many years of carrying a name that never really fit. My blog had become part of my identity, not in the performative sense, but in a way that reminded me daily that I was more than the forgotten son. I was someone people listened to, someone whose story had made others feel seen, understood, braver. That mattered more than any title I'd ever tried to earn from my parents. One afternoon, I took a walk to the lake near my apartment. It was a place I'd visited often when I first moved to Des Moines, back when I was too broke to do anything but walk and think. I used to sit on a bench there and stare at the water, wondering when life would start to feel like my own. That day, the lake was half thawed. Ducks floated across the slush. Children played in patches of wet grass. I sat on that same bench and smiled at the thought that this time, this now, was the life I had waited for. Halfway through my walk home, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. For a second, I almost let it ring out, but something in me said, "Answer." "Hello?" A pause, then a voice I hadn't heard in months. "Nate, it's Brandon." I froze. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd misheard. My grip on the phone tightened. I looked out across the lake, searching for something to ground me. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I wasn't sure if you'd pick up. Neither was I. What do you want? I asked, my voice colder than I intended. I'm not calling to ask for anything, he said quickly. I read the blog. Another pause. And the letter you left. Mom and Dad let me read it a few weeks ago. I stayed silent. I've been thinking about it a lot, he continued. And look, I know I was the favorite. I know I got away with everything. I know you were the one who always cleaned up my messes. I didn't realize it back then. Or maybe I did, and just didn't care. I don't know. I sat down on a low stone wall near the sidewalk, my legs suddenly heavy. I guess I just wanted to say, Brandon said, quieter now, I was a terrible brother, and I'm sorry. The wind picked up. I stared at the people walking their dogs, at the clouds drifting past. His words didn't move me to tears. They didn't spark rage or relief. They just sat there, like a long overdue knock on a closed door. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he added. I don't deserve that. I just thought maybe you deserved to hear it. That got me, not because I believed him completely, but because for the first time, he didn't center himself. He paused again. That's all. I'll hang up now if you want. No, I said after a breath. You can stay on the line. The silence that followed was strange, not tense but uncertain, as if neither of us knew who we were without the roles we'd always played. You doing okay? He asked eventually. Better than I've ever been, I answered truthfully. Good, he said, his voice cracking slightly. That's good. And then, just before we said goodbye, he asked, Do you think we'll ever talk again? I hesitated. Then I said, Maybe, one day, but that day isn't today. He didn't argue. Fair enough, he said. Thanks for answering. When I hung up, I felt a strange combination of grief and peace, like a chapter had ended, not with fireworks, not with finality, but with a single comma. Later that night, I wrote again. I titled the piece, When the Villain Says They're Sorry and You're Not Sure What to Do with It. It wasn't about Brandon directly. It was about how apologies, no matter how sincere, don't erase pain. About how we get to decide when and how healing happens. About how you can acknowledge someone's growth without letting them back into the center of your life. That post went viral. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. And people were ready for honesty. They were ready to hear that not every broken relationship ends with a hug, that sometimes distance is the healthiest boundary you can hold, that peace isn't always reconciliation. Sometimes it's just letting go of the need to keep hurting. I got messages from readers saying things like, Thank you for this. I needed permission to stop feeling guilty for not reconnecting. You're right, some doors stay closed. That doesn't make me bitter, it makes me wise. I cried reading this. My brother called me last week. I didn't answer. I think now I know why. That night, I sat on my couch, a soft blanket draped over my lap, a book unopened beside me. I didn't need answers. I didn't need closure. I just needed rest. And at last, I had earned it. April came with rain, not the angry kind, but the gentle drizzle that washes the dust from rooftops and softens the earth for new things to grow. I found myself walking more, sometimes without a destination, just letting my feet move while my mind wandered. I wasn't chasing healing anymore. I had found it, slowly, like dawn creeping into a dark room, quiet and undeniable. One afternoon, I passed by a small cafe I'd seen 100 times but never entered. Something about it pulled me in. Maybe the old brick walls, maybe the chalkboard sign that read, You're not late, you're right on time. Inside, the air smelled of coffee beans and warm pastries. I ordered a tea, found a corner table, and pulled out my laptop. I wasn't planning to write. But as the rain pattered softly outside and strangers murmured around me, I opened a new draft and began typing. Not a blog post this time, a book. It wasn't a grand decision, not a lightning strike moment. It was more like a whisper. Maybe your story deserves more than scattered posts. Maybe it deserves to be whole. The working title came quickly. The quiet one, How I Learned to Stop Earning Love That Should Have Been Free. It felt right, not polished, not catchy, but real. I outlined the chapters. Chapter 1, The Christmas I Wasn't Invited. Chapter 2, Grandpa's silence was louder than their praise. Chapter 3, When They Called Me Responsible but meant convenient, and so on. By the end of the afternoon, I had 4,000 words. I closed the laptop slowly, my hands warm around the tea mug, and felt something rare. Purpose. Not the desperate kind I used to chase, hoping it would make people proud, but a steady, quiet kind. The kind that said, even if no one ever reads this, it still matters, because it's mine. That same evening, I got an email from a woman named Elisa. She worked for a small, independent publishing collective. She'd been following my blog for months. She wrote, I hope this isn't too forward, but have you ever thought about turning your story into a book? I think people need it. We'd love to help you shape it. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Life has a strange sense of timing. When you stop screaming to be seen, sometimes the right eyes finally find you. I replied simply, I've started. Let's talk. We scheduled a call for the next week. The following morning, I visited Grandpa's grave for the first time since Christmas. The snow was gone, replaced by soft grass and the first hints of green. I brought wildflowers, laid them gently on the stone. Hey, I said aloud, kneeling. You were right. They didn't see me, but I do now. The wind was soft, the trees swayed gently behind the hill. I sat with him for a while, reading him the draft of my book from my phone, and as I read, I didn't feel bitter. I felt strong. Back in Des Moines, I kept writing, every evening, every weekend. I turned down some freelance work, trusting that the bills would get paid somehow. And they did. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to hold everything up. I was letting go of what didn't belong to me anymore. I started therapy too. Not because I was broken, but because I wanted to build something sturdy with all the pieces I'd reclaimed. My therapist Melissa asked me once, what would forgiveness look like if it didn't mean letting them back in? It stunned me, because I'd always thought forgiveness came with reunion, with soft music, tearful hugs, and warm tables. But maybe for me, forgiveness was writing the truth and not needing them to agree with it. Maybe it was remembering what happened and still choosing peace. Brandon texted a few times in April, nothing heavy, just check-ins. Hope you're good, Nate. Saw the new post, hit me hard. I'm in therapy too, it's weird but good. I didn't always reply, and when I did, it was short, respectful, clear. Boundaries. They were no longer walls. They were fences I had built with care, ones that kept me safe without keeping out the sun. My parents never called. I received a card from my mother in early May. It was handwritten, not a birthday or holiday, just a note. We're reading the blog, still learning, still ashamed, but grateful you're telling the truth, even if it hurts. Love, Mom. I placed it in the drawer with the others, not because I was keeping score, but because it was part of the story. That spring, the city bloomed, and so did I. Not into someone new, but into the version of myself I'd buried to survive. The version who didn't need applause to feel worthy. The version who walked with quiet conviction. The version Grandpa always believed was there. By June, the world felt louder again. Not the painful kind of loud, the kind that came from joy returning in small waves, the clink of coffee mugs in a sunlit cafe, children yelling as they chased a soccer ball across the park. Music floating through open windows. I had missed it, all of it, without realizing how long I'd been living under a thick silence that was never mine to carry. And within me, something else bloomed. Stability. Not the kind others imposed. You have a good job, be grateful. You're lucky to have family, even if they're distant, but the kind that grows when your roots finally settle into ground you chose. The book was coming along faster than I anticipated. With the help of Elisa and her small editorial team, we had refined the structure and voice. It wasn't just a memoir anymore. It was a manifesto for people like me. People who'd spent too long trying to earn basic love, mistaking silence for peace, tolerance for kindness. We changed the title, The Quiet Exit, leaving the life you were assigned to build the one you deserve. It was sharper, truer, and every word felt like bricks in a foundation I was finally building for myself. Then something happened that tested everything. One afternoon, I received an email titled, Request from Leonard Clark, my father. It was sent through the blog's contact form. No subject line, just his name. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Nathan, I don't know if this message will ever reach you. I know I've said almost nothing that deserved your time or trust. But I've been reading, every post, every sentence, and I see now what I refused to see for 30 years. Your mother and I were wrong, not just in how we treated you, but in how we chose not to see who you were becoming. I always thought I was being fair, that silence was respect, that not praising you meant I wasn't playing favorites. But you were invisible to me, and I let that happen. I failed you as a father. I can't fix it. I don't expect to be forgiven. But if someday you find it in yourself to let me apologize in person, I would be grateful. I'm sorry. Dad, I read it twice, then a third time, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, not joy, just a quiet understanding. He was trying. Too late? Maybe. But still, he was trying. I didn't respond. Not immediately. I let the letter sit in my mind for a few days, then mentioned it during my next therapy session. Melissa asked, "Do you want to reply?" I shrugged. "I don't know." She nodded. "Then maybe that's your answer. For now." So I did something else. I wrote a new post. When apologies come too late to change the past, but not too late to matter. It was honest. I didn't name him, but the message was clear. Sometimes people grow too slowly to keep up with the damage they've done, but their growth can still mean something, even if you no longer need it. That post exploded. Hundreds of comments from people who had felt the same. My dad apologized after I had my first child. I accepted it, but I never moved closer. It was enough. This line gutted me. Their apology didn't rebuild the bridge, but it stopped the fire from spreading. Thank you for showing that we don't owe anyone our presence just because they regret the absence they created. Later that week, I finally responded to the email. "Dad, I got your message. I hear the words. I believe you mean them. But I'm not ready to have that conversation face to face. This distance is not punishment. It's preservation. I hope you keep growing, Nathan." I sent it and closed my laptop. That night, I sat on the balcony of my apartment with a cold drink in hand, watching lightning flash in the distance. The wind was thick with the scent of rain and summer grass. And I realized something. I wasn't just healing anymore. I was thriving, not because they changed, but because I stopped waiting for them to. The book moved into final edits. Elisa's team designed a cover, simple, bold, with a quiet silhouette walking out of a fading doorway. We chose a release date, September 12th. Exactly 9 months after I walked away from my family on Christmas Eve. The symmetry of it made me smile. In the meantime, I kept living. I adopted a rescue dog, an older mutt with gray around the eyes and a tail that wagged as if the world owed him nothing, but still chose to be kind. I named him Gus. He followed me from room to room, slept beside my desk as I wrote, and nudged my arm when I stared too long at the screen without typing. He didn't care who I used to be. He just cared that I stayed. One evening, I took Gus on a walk to the lake. The sky was a painter's dream, bruised purple and orange streaks over rippling water. We passed a father teaching his daughter how to skip stones. Her giggle echoed over the shoreline. I smiled. Then I sat on our usual bench, watched the world move without asking anything of me, and whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular. Maybe to myself, maybe to Grandpa, maybe to the version of me that finally chose to be seen. July arrived in a blaze of golden heat and long, slow evenings. In Des Moines, the cicadas sang loudly in the trees, the sidewalks radiated warmth well into the night, and I found myself leaning into a kind of quiet that I hadn't known was possible. It wasn't silence born from neglect anymore. It was stillness, chosen and protected. The book was finished, the cover finalized, the layout polished. Advance reader copies were printed and sent out. I held one in my hands for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon, its matte finish cool beneath my fingers, my name printed cleanly across the bottom of the cover, like a signature I had finally allowed myself to make permanent. It felt surreal. Not because I doubted the story, but because I had spent so many years believing that my truth was too quiet to matter. And now here it was, tangible, real. I sat at my desk, Gus curled at my feet, and flipped through the pages. The words were mine, every paragraph a scar, every chapter a breath, every sentence a step toward freedom. Elisa called me later that day. "We've submitted it for review to a few media outlets," she said, excitement in her voice. "And I've got news. Your story's going to be featured on a podcast next month, one with a big following." I blinked. "Seriously?" "They loved it," she said, "and they want you to record an interview." A long pause stretched between us. "Are you okay with that?" she added, more gently now. I looked at the book again, at the last page where I'd written a note to readers. This book isn't about getting back at anyone. It's about walking away from what hurts, even when it looks like love. Especially then. I nodded slowly, then remembered she couldn't see me. Yeah, I said, I'm ready. But even as I agreed, something stirred inside me, a question I hadn't asked in months. Would they read it? Would my parents pick up this book, see their reflections in the pages, and finally understand the weight I'd carried? Would Brandon? And if they did, what then? I didn't know, but I didn't dread the thought anymore. A few days later, I received a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a small box and a handwritten card. The handwriting was familiar. Nathan, I saw the announcement. I pre-ordered a copy. I don't know if I have the right to be proud, but I am. I know this book isn't for us, but I hope it still reaches us. Love, Mom. Inside the box was a photo frame, a picture I had forgotten even existed. It was me and Grandpa Harold, standing in front of his barn. I must have been 11. He had one arm around my shoulder. I was holding a wooden bird in my hand, the one I'd carved with him that summer. We were both smiling, really smiling. I stared at that photo for a long time. I didn't cry, but my chest ached the way it does when something long buried surfaces gently, without warning. I placed the photo on my desk beside the book, and I whispered, "Thanks for seeing me." Not to my mother, not even to Grandpa, but to the boy in the photo, the one who had waited so long to feel worthy. That weekend, I drove to the farmhouse. Grandpa's house had been sold to a family friend after his passing, but I had arranged to visit one last time before the new owners moved in. The place looked nearly the same. The wind chime still hung on the porch. The swing still creaked in the breeze. I walked around the back to the old garden, now overgrown but still familiar. The pine trees rustled gently, just like they had that Christmas Eve when I ran from the coldest betrayal of my life. I stood there for a long time, remembering, not reliving, just remembering. I left a copy of the book on the porch. Taped to the cover was a note. For whoever lives here next, may this house always be a place where someone feels safe enough to be themselves. On the drive home, I didn't think about my parents. I didn't think about Brandon. I thought about the small things, the smell of cedar, the weight of Grandpa's tools in my hands, the way the light used to fall through those old farmhouse windows at dusk, and how for a short time I had known unconditional love in that place. That was enough. More than enough. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I walked Gus to the lake. The water shimmered orange and gold, ducks drifting lazily in the reflection of the sky. I sat on the same bench I always did. And as the breeze kissed my skin, I realized something. I had stopped waiting for the apology that would make the past make sense, because the past didn't need to make sense. It just needed to be behind me. And it finally was. August arrived like a quiet drum roll, steady and full of anticipation. The heat in Des Moines softened into a balmy warmth, and the days felt longer in a way that didn't demand anything from me. I had spent years chasing significance, approval from my parents, a place in my family, a reason to be proud of who I was. Now I simply was. And that, finally, was enough. The release of the book was days away. Elisa's team had done an incredible job. The pre-orders exceeded expectations. An independent bookstore in St. Paul requested a small reading. A journalist reached out for an interview. Then the podcast aired. It was called Unspoken, a show dedicated to stories about the invisible fractures in relationships. Sibling rivalries, family estrangement, generational guilt. They titled the episode after a quote from my book, "Love shouldn't be something you earn like a paycheck." The interview itself was recorded in my apartment, Gus lying at my feet the whole time. The host, a woman named Dara, was gentle, thoughtful. She didn't rush. She asked questions that didn't cut, but revealed. "What do you wish your younger self could hear from you now?" she asked near the end. I thought for a moment, then answered, that it's okay to stop knocking on the door that never opens, that walking away isn't quitting, it's choosing yourself, that the quiet isn't proof you were wrong. Sometimes it's proof you finally stopped begging. When the episode aired, the response was overwhelming. Strangers from all over the country reached out. I cried listening to this in my car. I've never heard someone put into words what I've carried for years. Your story gave me the courage to tell my family I won't be home for Thanksgiving. It's the first time I'm doing what's right for me. I felt seen. Thank you. And then, something I didn't expect. I received a message from Brandon. He had listened to the podcast. It wasn't long. Just a text. You sounded like someone I wish I'd known better. I'm still learning, still sorry. No demands, no guilt, just quiet acknowledgement. I stared at it for a moment, then replied, "Me too, and I believe you're trying. Keep going." That was all. I didn't feel the need to extend an invitation or rebuild what had never truly been built in the first place. But I also didn't need to punish him anymore. He was his own person now, as was I. A few days before the book's release, I got another letter from my father. His handwriting had always been blocky and firm, like someone trying to carve their words into permanence. "Nathan, I've read the book. I read every word slowly, more than once. I don't recognize the man I was in those pages, but I know it was me. I see it now, the coldness, the blind pride, the way I dismissed your quiet strength because I didn't understand it. There's no fixing the past, I know that, but I want you to know I am proud of the man you've become. Not because you wrote a book, but because you told the truth, even when it hurt. I understand if this letter means nothing, but if it means anything, thank you for not becoming bitter. You had every reason to. I hope life gives you the love we didn't know how to show." I sat with that letter for a long time. I didn't cry, but I felt something lift, not closure, but release. My father wasn't asking for a reunion. He wasn't asking to be part of the celebration. He was simply owning it. And maybe in the language of a man who never learned how to speak emotionally, that was as loud as he could ever be. I placed the letter in the same drawer where I'd kept the others. Then I closed the drawer, not out of dismissal, but with reverence. Some things don't need to be rewritten, just acknowledged. September 12th arrived. The book launched. I didn't throw a party, no balloons, no live stream. I spent the morning walking Gus through the neighborhood, sipping coffee from a paper cup, watching the world go about its ordinary rhythm. I stopped by a local bookstore that carried the book and saw it on the shelf, 5th row from the top, wedged between two titles about identity and survival. I didn't move it. It belonged right there. When I got home, I opened my inbox. Dozens of messages. One stood out. It was from a college student in Ohio. "I gave your book to my mom. We read it together. She didn't say much, but afterward, she cried and said she wanted to try again. I don't know if we'll make it, but thank you for opening that door for us." That evening, I sat on the floor beside Gus and read a few pages aloud from the chapter I'd written in Grandpa's old office. The one that began with, "Sometimes leaving isn't the end of the story. It's the start of it finally being yours." And I smiled, because it was mine, all of it. The pain, the silence, the clarity, the peace. I didn't need their love anymore, but I still wished them healing, because I had found mine. Autumn descended quietly. The leaves in Des Moines turned amber and gold, drifting down in slow, thoughtful spirals. The breeze carried that dry, familiar scent of change, like books left open too long or wood smoke curling through chimney tops. It was the kind of air that reminded you to pause, to look back, to take stock of what had passed and how far you'd come. It had been nearly a year since that December night. A year since I drove through a snowstorm carrying gifts no one asked for and overheard the conversation that changed everything. A year since I left behind the version of myself that waited for permission to be seen. And now here I was, no longer waiting. The book was a success by every metric that mattered to me. Sales were steady. Bookstores across the country picked it up. An audiobook followed. But the real victories came in the emails, the messages, the letters. Every day someone new wrote to say, "I thought I was the only one. I read this with my sister and we cried together. You gave words to what I couldn't name." I had become a voice not because I was loud, but because I told the truth softly, clearly, and without shame. And in doing so, I had become someone I didn't just recognize, but someone I respected. By October, my inbox included an invitation to speak at a conference, an event centered around emotional estrangement, healing from narcissistic family dynamics, and rebuilding after betrayal. At first, I hesitated. The idea of standing in front of strangers telling my story out loud felt raw in a way writing never had. But then I thought of my younger self, the one who sat in silence at the corner of the holiday table, the one who sent money without being asked and never got a thank you, the one who thought love had to be earned through usefulness, and I said yes. The night before the event, I practiced my speech while Gus dozed on the couch. I stumbled a few times, not on the hard parts, but on the hopeful ones. It was still difficult sometimes to speak about healing as something I deserved, but I kept going. The next day I stood on a stage in front of 100 people, some teary-eyed, some arms crossed, all listening. I told my story not with rage, not with vengeance, but with clarity. I talked about quiet children, about forgotten sons, about walking away not as rebellion, but as reclamation. And when I finished, the room was still. Then someone clapped, then another, and then the room erupted into a wave of quiet, earnest applause that shook something loose in my chest. Later, a woman in her 60s came up to me. "I'm estranged from my daughter," she said, voice trembling. "Reading your book helped me understand what I never saw in myself. I'm trying now. I just wanted you to know." I nodded, heart tight. "Trying matters," I said softly. "Trying always matters." Back in Des Moines, the season turned colder. I pulled my scarves from the closet, watched the first frost bloom across the grass in delicate silver threads. On a late Sunday morning, I took Gus out for a walk around the lake. As we strolled past the trees with leaves like fire, I thought about my family. Not with pain, not with longing, with stillness. Brandon still texted once in a while, small things, a song he thought I'd like, a photo of a hike he'd taken alone. He never pushed, never asked for more, and I appreciated that. My mother sent a letter on my birthday in late November. It was shorter than before. "Nathan, no grand words this time, just, I hope you're well. I'm thinking of you. I love you." I didn't write back, but I folded the note and placed it in the same drawer with the others, not to forget, but to remember that people can try even when they're late, and we get to decide if we open the door or simply nod from the window and return to our peace. Grandma June called me the week before Thanksgiving. "How's my best boy?" she said, voice bright and warm. We talked for an hour about her garden, the neighbor's new cat, the stew she'd made from scratch. She didn't ask about the book. She didn't ask about the past. She just asked about me. "Come visit soon," she said. "I saved your favorite blanket for the couch." "I will," I promised. "I always will." And I meant it. Because family, I had learned, isn't who you're born to. It's who holds space for you when you're learning to hold it for yourself. That night, I wrote one last post on the blog. "You were never meant to be small to make others comfortable." It was a letter to the version of me who once curled up in corners, too scared to take up space. I ended it with this. "Let them call you distant. Let them call you changed. You are. You are distant from the lies they taught you about love, and you have changed into someone who knows that being soft doesn't mean being silent, that boundaries are not a betrayal, that love is not a leash. You are free, and freedom will never apologize for its echo." I hit publish, then closed the laptop. Outside the window, the wind picked up. Gus curled at my feet. I took a breath, and I smiled. Because the quiet had never been empty. It had just been waiting for me to fill it with my own voice, my own life, my own name.